Hey everyone, it's been a while since I posted a review of a camera, so I thought I'd do one this morning. And so I've been wanting to do the review of this wonderful Nikon FA camera for quite a while, but it is a complicated camera and the one that I wanted to get to know a little bit before I dove in and tried to do a little bit of a review slash overview on it. So bear with me, because if something's not quite right or I didn't explain it good enough, please ask questions below or make a comment. I appreciate the community participating in this effort. So anyway, the Nikon FA is basically a prosumer or a semi-professional camera that was popular in the early 80s. Actually, one could say that it wasn't quite popular in the early 80s because it was kind of known as a techno camera or a technology camera, and so people were just kind of leery of it when it first came out in some ways, and it never really sold as well as some of the other Nikons that we all know and some of us love, like the F3, FE, FM series, and so on. The reason why it was a techno camera is because it basically introduced a new concept, which was known to all of us later as the matrix metering mode. It wasn't called that at the time. It was called automatic multi-pattern metering. And so basically what you had going on is the camera would take the frame and it would divide it into a center area, but also four surrounding areas covering the full frame. So basically there would be a five areas that the camera would matrix meter, and so it would basically use a computer to try to figure out what the best exposure was for the coverage of the entire frame. Point being is if you had the tricky kind of situations where you had a kind of a big highlight like we have up here in the corner, and you had a kind of a dark shadow spot down here or something of that sort, it would try to actually even out the exposure so it wouldn't blow out the highlights or lose the shadow detail. In my experience, it works very well if you have one of these, and I believe it's might be the first camera ever that had that. Of course, you can turn that off and go back into a normal center weighted metering as well. I think the fact that this camera is from the 80s and it still functions as it should, considering the electronics that are in it, I think that by itself shows that they're actually very good and very reliable cameras. When you read online, you find out a lot of people who had these shot with them a lot and have a lot of good things to say about them. You can get one of these bodies online for as little as $120 to $150, so I think it's a pretty good buy, and it does take Nikon F mount lenses. It goes with both the so-called AI lens and the AIS lens, and most of the functionality is actually available with both. There's basically just one mode, which would be nowadays called the program high-speed mode, that was only available with AIS, which basically is kind of preferring the shutter speed because longer lenses need the shutter speed to reduce the potential camera shake. Okay, so I'm gonna take a quick spin around this and show you some key things here, and we'll go from there. So in order to load film, I usually start there. Pretty much all these Nikon cameras kind of have a protection on this knob here, because traditionally what you do is you hold the knob and you pick up on it, and that basically opens up the door. But here you're going to find that you can't quite do that because there is this little lever knob, whatever we want to call it, right below that's like a safety. So what you have to do is just press that in to the right a little bit, and while you're holding pressed, that's going to allow the rewind knob to come out, and then when you pull up on it even a little bit more, the door is going to be open. While we're there, I want to point out one nice thing about this camera. It actually has a kind of a honeycomb pattern titanium shutter in there, which allows the camera to go up to 1/4000th of a second, which is quite a bit, and it is nice if you kind of want to do shallow depth of field kind of shots in the middle of the day or so. And if you're, let's say, shooting a ISO 100 film, it does give you some possibilities there, I suppose you could say. Other than that, it's unremarkable in there. Like most cameras, you would put your film lead in here, make sure it's over these little sprocket rollers, and then you just start winding the film manually once you close the door. One interesting or strange things about Nikon cameras that I had to learn when I first got into them is that when you first put the film in and before the winder is to number 1, the camera will actually fire at a 250th of source speed. It doesn't matter, it basically won't meter until the film is in position, and then once you get up to 1 it will start doing it, and you actually heard now how the speed of the shutter changed. Okay, so that's that. Moving on from here to the next spot, we're just going to talk about the viewfinder a little bit. Great viewfinder, I quite like it. If you look inside, what you're going to see is several things in there. First of all, in the upper left, you're going to see an LCD screen that has multi-purpose, so it can either read out the shutter speed, or it can read out the aperture, or in the manual mode it's going to tell if you're overexposing and underexposing. So it's kind of changing its function depending on which one of these selectors you made, either program, shutter, aperture, or manual priority. Next to it is kind of a traditional Nikon way of showing you the f-stop, which is basically an optical view of the f-stop, and so as you spin the f-stop ring, you're going to see what f-stop you're at. To the right of that, you're actually going to see the shutter speed, but I believe it's only available if you're in a shutter speed mode or in the manual mode. If you're in a program, I'm not sure that it shows up, but don't hold me to it. Yeah, and then all the way on the right there, there's a red LCD that will show up if you actually are using exposure compensation. Which I suppose I should go back to this wheel and just mention that when you're done setting your film, you actually have to manually set the ISO, and there's a little tiny red dot here that corresponds to the number. So for instance, right now it's set to ISO 200. Okay, so then moving on from here to the right, we're gonna get to the shutter. Obviously, again, kind of a traditional way to set the shutter speed. You just spin this and you set it to whatever you would like it to be. One thing that I want to mention is that this camera requires batteries to operate, but Nikon usually puts in a manual override for 1 shutter speed. So basically, if you run out of battery and you're in a situation where you still want to or need to take some shots, you can press this little button here and get yourself into M250 mode, and now that's a mechanical shutter, not battery operated, but it's only going to operate at that speed. Bulb mode is just past there as well. Maximum 1 second length shutter. After that, it's bulb. Okay, another thing maybe worth mentioning is the 250th of a second setting, which is shown in red. This is actually the sync speed with the flash, which is actually very high. It's probably one of the cool things about this camera. So if you're gonna have a Nikon flash put on, you can put it into a TTL mode actually, and if you set that to 250th of a second, then you're gonna have a high 6-speed TTL flash. But the coolest part about this camera, which is why I like it, is because it's kind of modern in a way that you have this program, shutter, aperture, and manual mode, and that's something pretty amazing for a camera of this age. It works very well, like I said. So just to kind of make it simple, and the way you adjust it is there's again a little kind of a plastic knob here that has a corresponding 180-degree version of it down here, and so you kind of grab both of them and you spin. It's not that easy to show, but that's kind of how it works. So if you put it in the manual mode, just like always, you look through a viewfinder, you look at the plus minus in the upper left to tell you when you're right on, and you achieve that by changing the shutter speed in the apertures. If you go in the aperture mode, which is probably the one I use the most, basically camera will adjust the exposure length depending on your f-stop that you selected. So that gives you a little bit of a creative freedom. If you're shooting something critical like I did in some of the shots I'm going to show you, when you want to kind of drag the shutter or like kind of make a background blur, then you maybe use that with the appropriate AI or AIS lens, and that's going to let you then kind of get that blur, or maybe keep a high shutter speeds from some bird photography or something like that. And if you don't want to think about stuff much, you can put it in program mode. And one thing to mention is when you are in a program or shutter mode, you actually need to put the lens all the way up to 22, which is, can't see it very well, all the way up to 22. This puts the lens into the minimum aperture and allows the camera then to control if it wants to go all the way up to minimum or it wants to pick which one in between. If you don't do it, there's going to be like a little error sign in the LCD screen. It's going to tell you that you got to do that before it will function like it should. There's actually also another little featurette here. If you see this little black lever, if you were to take a shot, and let's go to manual mode and put it to 60th to a second. Whenever you pull this, it will actually advance the shutter. I'm sorry, yes, advance the shutter and advance the film. Or cock the shutter and advance the film rather. But if you actually pull and hold this down while you do this, then it's going to only put the shutter or cock the shutter back in the operation to take the next shot, but it will not advance the film, which means you can then do a multiple exposure on the same frame of film. You can do this as many times as you want, so you can have 3, 4, 5 multiple exposures on the same film. Another thing I forgot to mention is this is in several or almost all of Nikons of this age. The way the camera turns on is by actually pulling this lever out like this. Some people hate it because if you're use your left eye, this can kind of get into your right eye. I use the left eye and I don't find it to be that big of a deal. But I think the reason why that was, even though I don't believe ergonomics were very good, is because a lot of times you'd actually want to have your thumb right here, because that would let you kind of quickly advance to the next shot. And so theoretically, if your thumb was here, that would kind of cover that space anyway and perhaps not bug you as much. But nonetheless, I don't think it's the best human factors design engineering at work here. All right, hopefully I covered enough there. So a couple of 3 other quick things. If you want to cover the viewfinder for night shots and you want the light coming in through it, you close it like that. It's another cute little feature in a lot of Nikon cameras. You have a f-stop stop down here. I don't know if you can see it there, but when you press this down, it actually lets you do depth of field preview. This right here is the self timer. I will not activate it right now, but if you pull back and trigger the shutter, then it's going to buzz down until it gets to 0 and then take a shot. It's at 10 seconds. This here is interesting and something that's easy to forget, and it's kind of such a bizarrely placed button, but can't even show it to you very well. It's basically a button that when pulled out, it allows the camera to be in a matrix metering mode. But if you don't want that, you want back your center weighted metering for whatever reason, if you actually pull in and then twist forward, it will actually get itself into a center weighted. And the way you know is because there is actually now a red dot there. You can't see very well. It's actually facing up. That means you're in center weighted metering. So if you want to get out of it, you just press back in. You kind of twist counterclockwise, and this now is out, and the red's not on top. And that means you're back in its native matrix metering. You can take off this little grip by removing the screw, and then you can put in a full motor drive attachment, MD15 or MD12. They work pretty good. I've used one for a shoot. If you can get one pretty cheaply, they're nice. The batteries are LR2244 or SR44 or VARD 357 or 357 battery or any version thereof. They're actually 2 small 1.5 volt cells that go in together. You can get those everywhere nowadays still without any problems. I'm just going to go through some of the other specs super quick if you're interested, that might be of interest. So the viewfinder is 0.8x magnification with 50mm lens set at infinity with a 93% frame coverage. Focus screens are replaceable with several other variants on the market. Exposure is TTL through the lens. Like we said, metering is either automatic multi-pattern or center weighted. The ISO settings can be all the way up to, let's see, 12 to 3200, which is pretty nice. I think you can actually go a little bit past, like 4000. Exposure compensation is ±2 exposure values. And like I said, the flash sync speed is at 1/250th of a second, which is nice. So that's really about it.
Yeah.